All right. 1 Kings chapters 8 and 9, verse 9. The temple operations begin. This is kind of like Solomon's leading a ribbon cutting ceremony. The temple's open for business, that kind of thing. The Ark of the Covenant, the symbolic container of that covenant agreement between God and Israel, is brought to the finished temple building. Huge celebration, corporate worship and praise of God, sacrifices brought, expressions of thankfulness, recognition of provision, and fulfillment of God's promises. So this is what's going on. And Solomon here reminds the people of the grandeur and faithfulness of God. And then there's this prayer that is recorded and it's finished with the formal dedication, and God's response is reiteration of covenant and relationship with Solomon, kind of that David's lineage, and Israel. And yet there's a lot that can be highlighted here. The idea of God's name being attached to the temple and also to the nation, to the people. So kind of how they conduct themselves, what happens to them reflects upon God. God's attaching himself. Which again is an amazing, amazing thing to consider, that God has attached his reputation to his people. So if you're listening to this, to you, God has attached his name to you. There's the mention of God giving rest in verse 56 of chapter 8 to Israel. Again, this is an Eden language promise reality. Rest doesn't mean like, rest from working, that they're, Adam and Eve were going to work in the garden. They were stewards of that, but there's a quality of life where order has fully conquered disorder, where there's that rest is one where there's just living in that space of peace with God and with others. And there's other things, but what I want to prompt us to look at, to consider, is Solomon's prayer and how it is so connected to covenant and God's promises, both for obedience and disobedience, for loyalty and disloyalty. In the midst of this prayer comes verse 30 with this reminder of the faithfulness of God to forgive when we repent of our disloyalty. Solomon's prayer showed an understanding that if Israel would continue in disloyal living, that other things would be more important than listening, trusting, and obeying God. That Solomon reminds himself, he reminds Israel, that God would withdraw not only his blessing, but would withdraw that relationship, would withdraw that association, because Israel had betrayed and abandoned covenant. Again, a good way for us to picture this and go, what's God doing? How does that work? Why is God doing this? Is remember that God sees himself as being married to his people. So we think of a healthy marriage covenant relationship. If one spouse is, I don't want to have anything to do with you, I don't want to be associated with you, I'm going to go somewhere else, I'm going to go associate, I'm going to act as though I'm married to someone else, that abandoned spouse, how would we expect them to respond? What would be healthy for them to do? And so I think that helps give us a window of understanding the language of this prayer and of a lot of the Old Testament. Marriage has been given to humanity by God as a picture, as an illustration of the kind of relationship God is inviting us to be into with him. And so here's a weird way maybe to ask a question for us to reflect. How do you today be a good spouse to God? And again, maybe you're listening to this and you're not married, you've never been married, and so it's kind of odd for you to think about it that way. That's okay. You still likely have some kind of image of what a healthy marriage would look like. And again, marriage, isn't the only image or the most important image. It's just one of those. And so just how do we be a loyal spouse to God today? How might that look for you? As you discern that, again, just listen to God, trust what he says, and obey him. As you do that, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you. May the Lord be gracious to you. And today would you know his peace. God bless.